Love about Center Point Church. There's lots of things I love about Center Point, but in my conversation with people here, I've noticed that there's a whole variety of different church backgrounds that people have come from, and it's very fitting that I've had the privilege and the joy of serving here, because I like to joke that I'm a denominational smorgasbord. I joke that I'm a Catholic Pentecostal Wesleyan, because I have some roots in Catholicism. Like, my family was, and still is, diehard Roman Catholic. My parents, they spent some time in the Assembly of God Church, which is like night and day when you compare the two of them. But my earliest memories of church were in the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church that my grandparents attend, they have these little, they're hat hangers, but they're like coat hangers, and they sit on the backs of the pews, and they're spring-loaded. And this is a really fun plaything for a 4-year-old, right? So what I would do when we would go sit in the pew, because they didn't really have anything available for children at church, I would take that spring-loaded hat hanger, and I would just snap it and hear the sound reverberate back, and it was just this glorious noise that it made. And my mom or my grandmother would just do one of those whisper yells at me. They'd be like, "Michael, stop it." And it's because in the Catholic Church, there's this sense of reverence when you walk into the sanctuary, right? And it was taboo to make any sort of noise that could be construed as disruptive to the worship experience. So the way you showed reverence in the Catholic context was by keeping quiet, right? Now, fast forward a few years into my family's faith journey. My mom and stepfather, they got saved under the ministry of an Assembly of God church, so we started attending there shortly before they got married and after they got married. So a good portion of my childhood was in that context, and that is like night and day. There was still reverence there, but the way they expressed that reverence was totally different, and it was not by keeping quiet. Not at all. People were running up and down the aisles, waving flags, banging on tambourines, shouting hallelujah. Okay. But here's the thing. Both expressions, as different as they were, would use the same word to describe what happens on Sunday morning. And that word is worship. Worship. Now, if you've been away with us for a couple of weeks, or this is the first time that you're here joining us, we've been in this series for a couple of weeks called The Language of Faith. And so in this series, we're looking at some of the key vocabulary that we use in the Christian faith. And this is for those of us who are familiar with these terms, or maybe even over familiar with these terms, and for those of us who are unfamiliar with them. So if you've grown up in a church context, or you haven't grown up in a church context, this series is for you. And the goal of this is just plain and simple. We want to make each and every one of these words as accessible as possible for you, so that you can carry them with you into your life, into your relationships, into your marriages, with your children, and everything else that goes on in your life. So today what we're doing is we're looking at this word, worship. And as I said, I grew up in two very different contexts. One very rigid and regimented, the other one quite a bit looser. They both use this word, worship. And one of the things that I often struggled with as an elementary age kid was this question of, okay, which one's the right way and which one's the wrong way? Because the adults told me the other one's was the wrong way and theirs was the right way, right? The Protestants said, well, the Catholics got it wrong. And the Catholics would say, no, the Protestants got it all wrong. And maybe you haven't asked this as an adult, but maybe the question has popped up into your mind, what is true, authentic worship? And what's false worship? So that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today. And one of the things that I would always hear in ministry, people would constantly tell me, okay, we need to sing more hymns. Or we need to sing more contemporary songs. We need more guitar. We need less guitar. We need more drums. We need less drums. We need more organ. We need to get rid of the organ. So any variation of those complaints I would receive as a pastor. And here's why. Just in this context alone, we have 80 to 100 adults worshiping here in the worship center. And with the 80 to 100 adults here, we have 80 to 100 different expectations and assumptions and preferences around what worship is and what worship should be like. I don't know if you know this, but worship has been turned into this million-dollar industry in our country. We associate it with personalities on stage, singing the songs we like, giving us the feel-goods when we sing them. That's what we would reduce worship to. But worship, in the biblical sense, is much fuller and richer and deeper than all the things that we've attached to it. So if your default, and I think it's everybody's default, is to complain that you don't like the worship on any given Sunday for whatever reason, or you didn't experience the presence of God when you were worshiping, when you were singing, or for some reason we didn't sing the right songs, I know I'm going to step on some toes here, but most of the time, the issue isn't with the quality of worship. The issue isn't with the songs we sing or don't sing. The issue is our hearts. The issue is the attitude we bring into the worship experience when we come. Right? But for some strange reason, we've associated personal preference, what I like and what I don't like, and we've put it in the same category as right and wrong. Right? But if someone says, I like an organ, and the other person says, I like electric guitar, that's not right or wrong. That's simply a matter of what you like and what you don't like. And I like to think of it this way. Ever since I was introduced to ice cream, I love cookies and cream ice cream. I just do. It's my favorite. It's my preference. But let's say we're at a party, say a birthday party, and I see you eating chocolate ice cream. And I approach you and I inform you that, that's the wrong ice cream. You really should be eating cookies and cream ice cream. How ridiculous does that sound? But for some reason with worship, we're totally comfortable saying, well, my preference, it's right. My preference is correct. And everybody else's is wrong. Now, in the last church that I served in, after a Christmas Eve service, we had a woman who had filled out a comment card. And this thing, she filled it up. Every single piece of white space on this card was filled up. And she had written this dissertation about how awful the worship was. And she said something to the effect of, this is a worship service, not a rock concert. And I remember thinking to myself, you thought acoustic guitar and drums was a rock concert? The Christmas Eve service here would have given this poor woman a heart attack. But we need to be aware. We need to be aware of what we've allowed into the category of true worship. Because we live in a consumer-driven, preference-driven culture. And without even being fully aware of it, our instinct is to say, true worship is what I like. True worship is what I prefer. And false worship is what I don't. Okay? So, now that I've offended everybody in the room, we're going to explore what is true worship in the biblical sense. We're going to be exploring a few passages this morning, but we're going to start by exploring a little bit of Jesus' words in John chapter 4. So if you have a Bible, whether it's digital or physical, I invite you to turn there. If you don't, that's okay. The words are going to be behind me on the screen. So most of our misconceptions surrounding worship and our tendency is to redefine what it is, and it's ended up causing us a lot of problems and a lot of issues in the church as a whole. And we've ended up dividing over things that we really don't need to be dividing over as a church. So it's so critical, it's so important that we get back to the words of Jesus on this matter. So in John chapter 4, Jesus gives us a pretty insightful look into what true worship is. And it comes out of this interaction that he has with the woman at the well. Now, Jesus and his disciples, they're traveling. They're going through this place called Samaria. Jesus' disciples' stomachs start to rumble, and they let their appetites take them into town to buy some food. And Jesus decides he's going to hang back at this well. And the well, back in that day, was kind of this communal gathering place. It was a common place where people would meet up. And this woman comes out there. She's a Samaritan woman. Jesus is a Jewish man. Now, it's an important detail because, long story short, Samaritans and Jews did not communicate with one another. They didn't have interaction with one another, let alone a Hebrew man and a Samaritan woman. It was unheard of for an Israelite male to interact with a Samaritan female. But Jesus does, and he asks her for a drink. Okay? And what Jesus does in this conversation, he uses this opportunity to transition from talking about the natural and into talking about the supernatural. He uses this metaphor of water to say, if you knew who was asking you for a drink, you would be asking him for water, and you would never thirst again. And in this conversation, he takes this woman deeper and deeper and deeper into the essence of what true worship actually is. But to get to the heart of it, Jesus asks this woman a series of very probing questions that get to this woman's heart. She's a woman who'd been married on several occasions, and the man that she's currently living with, it's a boyfriend or just some guy, but he's not her husband. And through this series of questions, Jesus brings her to this moment of crisis, and it's in this moment she realizes she's not dealing with any ordinary man. In verse 19 in John 4, it reads, "The woman said to him, 'Sir, I perceive you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship.'" Now just get this for a moment. This woman came into the conversation with Jesus with a preconceived idea about what worship is and what worship isn't. Her assumption is that worship is a place. It happens somewhere. Worship is where you go, right? And it's what's culturally considered normative. But the Samaritan woman's understanding of worship was actually limited. It was incorrect. And we're not much different, though, right? We limit our worship to an experience on a Sunday morning for an hour a week. Okay? So we're very similar to this woman. But gathering to worship together, to sing together, that is a good thing. That is something that we should value and we should regularly participate in. I'm not discounting that at all. But we can't limit the worship that we go into as Christians. We can't constrain it to what's considered culturally acceptable, and we can't limit it to location for an hour a week, for a day a week. When we do, we will quickly become spiritually anemic. We will become spiritually unhealthy. So Jesus continues in verse 21. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews." And he's referring to himself, by the way. Jesus is Jewish and he provides salvation for the whole world. Verse 23. "But the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." So the Samaritan woman who had confined worship to what was culturally normal and a particular location, she's now confronted with the words of Jesus. And notice, Jesus is talking about true worshipers and what a true worshiper does, which implies there can also be false worship. There's true worship and there's false worship. And he says the true worshipers will worship in both spirit and in truth. And what Jesus does for us here is he opens up this incredible, incredible reality that worship is something that ultimately God is seeking from you and I. But what Jesus doesn't actually do in this passage, he doesn't define for us what worship actually is. Do you notice that? So let's attempt to get on the same page. around what worship is. Now, our understanding of worship comes from the Old English word that means worthship, to describe worth or value to something, to give our attention and our affection to something. Whatever it is we devote the most of our time thinking about and giving our lives to, that is what we worship. That is what we give value to and worth to. But I want us to see how worship is actually played out in the Bible. So I felt like it would be helpful for us to actually look at the first time that worship is explicitly mentioned in the Scripture. And the first time we see the word worship is in Genesis chapter 22. So you can go from John and turn your way over to Genesis 22 if you like. Now, this is part of the story of Abraham. You may remember we talked about him a couple weeks ago. He's remembered as this man of faith. God gives Abraham this promise that his offspring was going to be turned into this great nation and was going to be this incredible blessing to the entire world. And he gives Abraham this commission to go and leave his hometown into this land he was going to show him. And Abraham's remembered as this person of faith because of it. But this promise that God gives to Abraham, God delivers on it. There's a significant waiting period from the time God gives Abraham the promise and God actually delivers on that promise. And it isn't a couple weeks, it isn't a couple years, it's actually a quarter of a century. Abraham is waiting for God to make good on what God had promised. So 25 years later, Isaac finally comes into the picture. And now, this is me reading between the lines here in this story a little bit. But I'm inclined to believe that because Abraham was a human being like you and me, because he was so overjoyed that this promise had finally been fulfilled, that Isaac had become the sole object of Abraham's affections. And so God one day asked Abraham, he says, Abraham, listen, everything that I've asked you to do, you've done it. You've withheld nothing from me. But I want you to do something. I want you to go up to this mountain, to Mount Moriah, and I want you to take your son up there, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And the very one that God had promised to Abraham, the one that God would use to bless the entire world, God says to Abraham, I want you to go, I want you to take that promise, and I want you to kill it. So Abraham does what God asked him to do. Now, of course, God provided a substitute sacrifice. Right? Abraham didn't end up sacrificing his son. But as he's preparing for this journey, there's this interaction that Abraham has with his servants. And in verse 5, he says, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. Right? What is Abraham doing? What is he saying? Well, he's not going up to build a campfire and sing Kumbaya. He's not doing that. He's doing something very significant here. And the word worship, it literally means, in the original Hebrew, it means to bow down, to physically lay down flat on the ground. And you would see characters in the Old Testament consistently do this when they had some sort of vision from God. But the essence and the very heart of worship isn't so much the physical act of bowing down. It's tied to what Abraham is about to do. When he says we are going to worship, he says we are going to sacrifice something. That's what worship is. It's sacrificing what is most precious to you. It carries with it the idea of complete, total surrender to God. To surrender to God what is most dear to us. To surrender what is most dear to us to the one who is greater. Now, this is amazing because when we see Jesus mentioning worship in John chapter 4, he's trying to move this woman he's interacting with, and you and I who would be reading this, into a better way of understanding what worship is and how people have learned to understand it. He's bringing people back to the heart of worship that we see in Genesis chapter 22. And while the Old Testament connects it to this idea of bowing down, the physical act of surrender means nothing if our heart isn't fully surrendered. The physical act of surrender means absolutely nothing if the heart isn't fully surrendered. It's why Jesus asked all these probing questions to this woman. He wanted to get to the heart of the matter. He wanted to get to the heart of what she had given her affections and her attention to. He needed to reveal that to her before she could worship the way God designed her to worship. Worship is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of the heart. So, in light of this, a few thoughts on worship, what it is and what it isn't. The first thing, worship is universal. Worship is universal, which means it's not if we worship, it's what or who we worship. So it's not either I worship Jesus or I worship nothing. It's I worship Jesus or I worship something or someone else. Because the cry of your heart and the cry of my heart is to worship our Creator. And so by default, we will end up filling that desire with something or someone. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 11 tells us that God has set eternity into our hearts, which means we are designed for a right relationship with God. But because of sin, that image of God inside of us wasn't destroyed, but it was marred. But that longing for a relationship with our Creator is still there. So all around us, we see people trying to fill that void with something. A couple years ago, my wife and I, we went to our first Bills game together. And that was quite the experience because it was a game where we were playing the Patriots. Yeah. And you could kind of guess how that went. So we went in, and I like to people watch when I go out into public places. And I'm looking at everybody's faces. They're all revved up. They're super excited. They're like, yeah, we're going to pound the Patriots and all that. And then after, the faces of those same people were downcast, despondent. Many of them were, drunk. And it's because, here's why. It's because their gods had failed them. All of their hopes were tied up in whether or not the Bills beat the Patriots. Human beings are very good at God replacement. We are very good at God replacement, worshiping gods of our own making. And this is where it gets really difficult for us. We can often replace God with really good things in our life. They're not bad in and of themselves. We can replace God with our children. We can replace God with our spouse. We can replace God with our jobs. We can replace God with our skills and our talents. All really good things. Good things that God Himself has given us. But when we replace the gift, when we put the gift in the place that was designed for the God who gave us that gift, that's when it becomes a problem. That's when it becomes an issue. Right? How many parents end up wrecking the lives of their kids because all of their worth and their value is tied up in whether their kids follow a particular career path or whether or not their kids get good grades? Parents, if you're doing that, you're worshiping your kids, and your kids can't handle the pressure. We can very easily end up worshiping our spouse, our husbands, our wives. If you're doing that, you're putting pressure on them that they are not designed to handle. Right? How many celebrities do we notice that they just end up losing their minds and they become totally unhinged after a while because they can't handle being the sole object of people's affections? We love turning people into gods. And they end up unraveling because of it. So, worship. Worship is universal. It's not if we worship, it's what we worship. Here's the other thing about worship. True worship doesn't invoke the presence of God. True worship isn't inviting God to come dwell where we are. True worship is a response to the presence of God. True worship doesn't invoke the presence of God. True worship is a response to the presence of God. Right? I think of Genesis 27. After Jacob wrestles the angel, he says, "Surely the presence of God is in this place, and I was unaware of it." Right? Now, we say something a lot in church, and I'm guilty of saying it too. After a really moving and incredible worship experience, we're like, "Oh man, God showed up today." What about what the Psalms tell us? It says, "Where can I go from your presence?" There's no place that you and I can go where God is not already there. So if you say, "Hey, worship was great, God showed up," well, I'll give you that somebody showed up, but it wasn't God. Okay? True worship doesn't invoke the presence of God. True worship is a response to the presence of God. Richard Foster said it this way. He said, "Worship is the human response to a divine initiative." So we don't sing that God might come. We sing because God is here. Okay? And so whether how on-key or off-key the music might be, which it was on-key, of course, this morning. It was awesome this morning, I thought. No matter what songs we're singing, we should be celebrating because the presence of God is with us. Okay? True worship doesn't invoke the presence of God. It's a response to it. Right? And I wanted to lay that foundation for us today to ask the question of what or who are we worshiping? And when we come into this place for an hour a week, what are we coming expecting to experience? We should come expecting to celebrate the fact that God is here. But the even bigger question now is, what does true worship look like? Right, so I want to spend just a little bit of our time talking about that. A guy by the name of A.W. Tozer, he said, if you don't worship 7 days a week, you don't worship 1 day a week. So worship isn't about the Sunday morning event. What we do on Sunday should be an outflow of the life of worship that we've lived the previous week. We don't worship 7 days a week. We don't really worship 1 day a week. And there's 4 things that I would say to be very true about worship. Say that true worship, it begins in submission. It's initiated by the Spirit. It's defined by truth and expressed in love. True worship begins in submission, is initiated by the Spirit, is defined by truth, and is expressed in love. Right? And so often in church circles, we can get into the rhythm, into the habit of reading our Bibles, into the habit of praying, into the rhythm of going to church. But it's very important that we continually examine whether we've given all of our lives, all of ourselves in complete submission to God. Because if we're trying to engage in spiritual activity without living a life of surrender, it's going to fry us. And we're going to feel like we're going through the motions. And I've had conversation with people who feel like they are burnt out in ministry. Okay? And the reason so many people feel burnt out in ministry isn't because they're doing too much. It's because they're not living a life of complete and total submission. Okay? So is there something that we're refusing to lay at God's feet? If so, it's going to keep us from really living a life of full and complete worship. It's why I love the language of the living sacrifice that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 12. And in the Old Testament sacrificial system, when a lamb or a goat or a bird or whatever they were sacrificing, when it was brought to the sacrifice and it was sacrificed, what was the purpose of that sacrifice once it had already been laid down at the altar? Is it getting back up? No. It's dead. It's burnt. It's not getting back up. And that's the metaphor that Paul uses for Christian living. It's this complete and total surrender. So a key part of living out of this victory that Christ is bought for us on the cross means accepting that we have now been crucified with Christ. That the old man and the old woman has been crucified with Christ on the cross so that the new man and the new woman can come. Submission simply means dying to the lie of who God never intended you to be. And it means giving you every single part of yourself to Him. It's giving Him your strengths and your weaknesses. It's giving Him your triumphs and your tragedies. It's giving Him your hopes and your hurts. It's giving Him the good and the bad. But unless we're totally surrendered to God and we're giving Him everything, even the things that we hold dear, we will never be able to truly worship. And it's only when we fully surrender that we can be guided by the Holy Spirit. And I like to think of it this way. Imagine that you're going to climb up Mount Everest. Are you going to do it by yourself? You could. It would be very reckless and stupid to do it by yourself. But theoretically, you could try to climb Mount Everest by yourself. But if you are a wise person, which I think every one of us is, you would enlist in the help of a guide. Somebody who knows the mountain and has studied the mountain. Somebody who knows the best way up and the best way down to get you through that experience safely. And the thing is, with the Holy Spirit, He comes alongside of us as our teacher, not only to relay information to us, but to guide us and to help us and support us. But here's the thing. You can have an amazing teacher, but if you're a lousy student, it won't matter. Okay? God can and God will teach you, but you have to be willing to be a good student. And it's relinquishing the leadership of your life over to God. It's letting God completely and fully be the leader of your life. Okay? It's saying to God, God, not my kingdom come, but yours. It's saying to God, not my will, but yours. And the truth is, for God's kingdom to come, my kingdom needs to go. For many of us, I wonder if we've truly surrendered every part of ourselves to God. Because when we do, we're going to live a life that's been initiated by the Spirit, where He comes alongside of us and helps us. And He's going to lead us into all truth. So He said worship is also defined by truth. And truth itself is a person, by the way. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So anything that leads us away from Jesus as revealed in the Scriptures is not from the Spirit. It's not from the Holy Spirit. And finally, true worship, something that I want us to really see and grab a hold of today as the worship team comes and leads us in a final song here. True worship is expressed in love. In Mark 12, there's this lawyer in Jesus' day that comes to Him and he says, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with everything you have, and love others in the same sort of way. He said everything, all of the Scriptures, hinge on these two things. And the natural outflow of a life of worship is a life of love. The natural outflow of a life of worship, somebody who's submitted fully to God, who's led by the Spirit, who is led towards the truth of the person of Jesus, is naturally going to live a life of love. Truly grasping the concept of what true worship is, it's the only way we're going to be able to love our spouses well. It's the only way we're going to be able to love our kids well, or our co-workers well. So as we come into this time of worship, would you invite the Holy Spirit to speak to you today? And I pray today that we will be reminded that worship is not about what happens for an hour a week on Sunday morning. If that's what you think worship is, you missed it. Worship is a life submitted to God, a life led by the Spirit, defined by the truth of Jesus Christ. And it's expressed in love. So would you lay down your personal preferences today as we worship? Let's pray. Father God, we come before you this morning. we thank you. We thank you for the cross. We thank you for the work that you have done for us, that we can never repay. All we can do is live a life of worship. Like the Samaritan woman, reveal what's in our hearts. Bring us back to the heart of what worship truly is. And ultimately, worship isn't about the songs we sing. It isn't about the style of music. It isn't about what we prefer, what we don't prefer. It's ultimately about you and living a life of surrender to you. Lord God, we thank you. We praise you. Speak to us as we worship.